Welcome to a world history lecture on the three Abrahamic religions. These three religions, if you've never heard of the Abrahamic religions before, are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And this is going to be a first part in a kind of two-part series look at world religions. We're going to look at these three first, and then the next series we will look at the Indian religions. So, just as a little reminder here on why we have religion or what the purpose of religion is throughout world history, we want to remember these kind of things here. One, it's defined right and wrong for people. It's helped explain why some things are right, why other actions are wrong. It's been a force to bring people together in a community and help them feel like they belong to something bigger than themselves. And then it's also brought a sense of order in explaining like why these people are in certain positions and why they should be there and why others shouldn't be there. You can see that come up in religions, and it can also help explain the unexplainable, so things that aren't known. And this was much more true today, or not today, but back in the day than today, because people didn't understand why the rain wasn't coming, why it wasn't raining when they needed rain really badly, or why it was raining too much and causing floods. They wanted a way to explain that stuff, and then as science has evolved, we haven't needed that as much, but we still need it for some things. There are still people that look for closure on why did this person die at the time they had to die, or if something terrible happens like a car accident and one person survives and one person doesn't, why were they the one that survived? So people look at that for a reason behind the sometimes random things that they see or the things that they can't explain normally. So that's why we have religion. Again, the Abrahamic religions here that we're looking at, they're Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they are the three probably largest, we could say, monotheistic religions in the world today. Judaism is the smallest of the three, but it's the oldest. And these three religions will have a lot of similarities beyond just what some of their practices and rituals are. But some of the basic ones here that we'll start with are just one, they're all from the Middle East. Judaism was founded in Mesopotamia and then in Israel, Palestine today. Christianity was then founded in that same region, and Islam was founded a little bit further away in Arabia, but all are found in that general region of the Middle East. They're all monotheistic traditions, even though we'll talk about Christianity is a little bit different with their monotheism and how they view their the God, the Christian God in that. But they're all monotheistic and they're all the same God. The God that we see in Judaism is going to be the same God in Christianity. In Islam, it's just the people relate to them and see them or it or whatever we want to call God, her, differently. And then lastly, they're all the reason why they're called the Abrahamic is because they're all founded by or have a father in Abraham. Who was originally Abram and then became Abraham after he started following this one true God. And so that kind of brings all these together, and that's why we call them the Abrahamic religions and why they're all related. And so we're going to dive into them. We're going to go in chronological order, looking at Judaism and then making our way to Christianity and then from there to Islam. Now, before we do that, there's one more thing we should look at, and that is, what does the world look like today with the Abrahamic religions? Like, how popular are they? And as you can see, if you look at this map, they're pretty popular. They cover most of the globe except for in India, China, and Southeast Asia, which is where we see the Indian religions, which we'll talk about next time. So these are the major centers, or just where Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are followed. Primarily, all this pink that we're seeing is Islam or Christianity. Judaism is very, very small in this and doesn't make up a majority of population in any region other than in modern-day Israel, which is right here if you can see the cursor. Okay. Now, the basics of Judaism are, one, it's monotheistic, as we've already talked about, and their God, or they call their God Yahweh. Sometimes it's spelled with vowels in it, other times it's not, and that's because the original Hebrew, which is the language of the Jewish people or the Israelites, didn't have vowels to start with. So it can get kind of confusing in translating things, but we're not going to get into all that stuff here. But here's the basics. They reach their religion all the way back to the founding of Abraham, and they say he was around about 1900 BCE. So about 4,000 years ago is when the religion was founded, which is would make it one of the oldest religions, if one of the oldest religions continually practiced today. We're going to give you that date because that's what they view it as, but the Judaism that we know of today and that we're going to be describing here in this is more from the 300s BCE, but it's been building on before that. But the modern practices and stuff like that we see, it come more in the 300s, going up into the about 100, 200 or so CE. So over that 500 years, 400, 300 years or so, it developed into what we see Judaism as today. It is from Palestine, Israel, like we already mentioned, and it has roughly about 14 million followers today. So not huge in the scope of religions. We're going to see Christianity and Islam are much bigger, but still a sizable portion of the population of where they're at. They make up a decent chunk of people, especially when we talk about Israel. Their holy book is known as the Hebrew Bible. You might refer to it, if you're a Christian, as the Old Testament. And that was put together over the centuries around that 300 to year zero time span of BCE. And their place of worship is known as a synagogue. It'd be similar to a church or a mosque that we're going to see, but slightly different, but similar concept. You would go there on the Sabbath day, which for them is going to be Saturday, and go and worship, sing some songs of praise, hear a sermon of some sort. And then there are many different branches of Judaism. We're going to just focus on a couple here, but there's the Orthodox, there's the Reform, there's the Conservative, and the Hasidic. We're not going to go into all the differences between them, but the Orthodox are more conservative. They're the most conservative, other than there are ultra-Orthodox branches that are even more than that. But what that means is that it's a fairly literal taking of what the Hebrew Bible says. The Conservatives are a little bit less than that, but still fairly literal, and the Reforms are using the Hebrew Bible as a guide through things, but not looking at it as the be-all, end-all thing. Some of the most important holidays for Judaism are Yom Kippur, which is their Day of Atonement, where they go to get forgiven for their sins or go to reflect on their sins, and Hanukkah, which is in December, which is a celebration of lights. Based on the menorah here that you see, it's a remembrance of the oil in the menorah staying lit for 7 days when it didn't have enough oil for 7 days. And then I already mentioned this, but their day of worship is on Saturdays. Okay. Now, some of the basic beliefs of Judaism are, one, that the Jewish people are God's chosen people, and they've had a contract with God to be His light on the world, to shine an example of how people are supposed to act. And one of the ways that you can see of how they're supposed to act is through what are known as the commandments or the laws. Most likely you've heard of the Ten Commandments, which are the famous ones, and you see them listed out here to the right. But there are a total of 613 different laws in the Hebrew Bible that list out what you should or shouldn't do. So there are things simple like in the Ten Commandments, like don't have any other gods, or don't worship idols, or don't steal from others, don't murder, respect your parents. So there are those simple ones, but then there are other ones that relate to food, like you cannot eat shellfish, or you have to prepare your meats in a certain way. There are other personal grooming ones, like circumcision that men have to go through, and there are other laws just saying what you can and can't do for other actions and for worship. And so one of those being that you don't do any work on the Sabbath. And then people will argue about, well, what does work on the Sabbath mean? And so you get super strict versions of the faith that say you can't do anything, so you can only walk around and you can't make anything or do anything like that. And then you have others, and so like one of the things is like they have to walk upstairs. They can't push buttons on elevators and stuff. So that'd be an example of that, going to kind of the extreme on that. And there's others that just say, well, you can't like do actual work. So if you're a lawyer, you can't do work on your case that evening. Or if you're a teacher, you're not grading stuff that that day on Saturday. Okay, and then one of the key rules that all these commandments kind of lead to is this idea of the golden rule that you should treat others how you would want to be treated. And you can see that with things like respect your parents, because when you're an adult and when you're a parent, you're going to want your kids to respect you. Don't commit adultery because you probably don't want your girlfriend or wife or husband or boyfriend cheating on you. Don't murder other people because you probably don't want to get murdered. So all these things kind of relate back to that golden rule idea on things. Now, we'll move on to the next one here on Christianity. The basics of Christianity is it's the same God. They don't call him Yahweh. Usually you'll refer to as Jesus because Jesus was the part of God that came to earth and then died. And I'll get into that a little bit more here. But you have this idea of this Trinity. And so you've got the Father, who's the God that created everything. Then you got Jesus, who's the Son that came down to earth and died on the cross for people's sins. And then you have the Holy Spirit, which is the thing that kind of connects everyone together. And so they're all part of the same God, but they're all separate entities within it. And that's where this gets kind of confusing in Christianity. But the best way that I can think of how to explain it is think about it as in chemistry terms. If we talk about elements and things like that, they've got different forms they can be in. So if we talk about water, I guess water is an element, it's a compound, but it has a liquid state, it has a solid state, and it has a gaseous state. And so you have different forms here. You could say the Father is like ice, the Son is like the water, and the Spirit is like water vapor. And so you can kind of think of it that way, that it's all the same, but it's just a different way to see that same God, okay? Or a slightly different form of it, but it's all the same thing. Now, this was founded by Jesus. His teachings were taken in by people. He was a holy man that went around from town to town doing miracles and preaching a new gospel in what the Jewish people should do. Really kind of getting away from some of those laws that define the Hebrew Bible and getting more into just how do you actually do good things every day. So he came up with it, the basic practices. He then gets crucified and dies, and then his disciples, along with this guy named Paul, go and spread this message. And Paul really does the most in spreading the message beyond the Jewish realm of things. And it leads to a lot of conversions, if not more conversions than anyone else. And so this all happens in the first century of the Common Era. And it starts out in Palestine, Israel, but then it spreads all throughout the Roman Empire. Without the Roman Empire being there, this might not have spread. Definitely, it would have been more difficult for it to spread beyond the borders of Israel if it wasn't part of a larger empire. And then that's allowed it to spread to today, where it's got 2.2 billion followers. Now, it wasn't always this way. This is the most popular religion there is in the world today, but it wasn't always this way. Islam used to be a lot more popular, but and was dominating the Eurasian world, Afro-Eurasian world, I should say. And then when the Europeans went out on their voyages with Christopher Columbus and whatnot in 1492, they landed in the Americas, and they converted a lot of the Native Americans to Christianity. And they also had a huge explosion of population because of the Industrial Revolution. I'm going way beyond what we need to do in this, but that allowed Christianity to eventually overtake and become the most dominant religion in the world today. Now, their holy book is known as the Bible, and it takes the Hebrew Bible, which they refer to as the Old Testament, and combines it with a New Testament based on the teachings of Jesus, and they make that into one book with the Old and New Testament. And that really lays out what you should believe as a Christian, what you should do. If you are a Christian on Sundays, which is the Sabbath day for them, you're going to go probably to church, or you might go to a cathedral, depending on how big your church is and which branch of Christianity you go into. But you're going to go there, and you're going to worship the Trinity there. Sorry for the bell ringing there. It's going to ring again here in a few minutes. We'll see how much more we can get through, but we'll probably have a little bit more going on here. So, Branches of Christianity, though, are Orthodox. Those are mainly going to be in Eastern Europe. You have the Catholic, which is the largest tradition of it, and it's based out of Rome with the Pope at the head of it. And then you got the Protestants who broke away from the Catholic Church when a guy named Luther, Martin Luther, kind of started things off and started something known as the Reformation. And then you get a bunch of different faiths in Protestantism, like you have Lutheranism, you have Presbyterianism, Calvinism, Baptists, evangelicals. All those things are part of this. And so you got many different branches in Christianity. We're just going to lump them into three groupings of the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Protestant. But no, the Protestants are much more divided than just saying they're Protestants. They've all got slightly different beliefs and their own little rituals and whatnot, or ideas on things in comparison to the others. Some of the major Christian holidays are Christmas and Easter. And again, I already mentioned their day of worship is Sunday, but that's when they'll go in. You'll also see Christians that go in at other days during the week to church based on how religious they are and what they're looking to do. Okay. Now, some of the basic beliefs are one, after Jesus came about, there was a new covenant, which was that agreement between God and the Jewish people that they would be the chosen ones. And this new one was that Christianity would now be the light to the world to show everyone the right way. And so there are a couple of things that they change are that now you need to believe in Jesus to go to heaven, which there really isn't much of a talk of a heaven in Judaism. It's just really not mentioned or worried about too much. And Christianity has a major focus on that. And that eventually Jesus will come back. So he will come back for final judgment, and he will have those that were loyal and worshipped him, or I shouldn't say loyal, but faithful, that were faithful to him, and the Christian faith, they will go to heaven, and the others will be judged and go to hell. So you have this afterlife of heaven and hell that comes from this. Also, there are 7 sacraments in Christianity initially. And those are what you can see to the right there of holy orders, baptism, confirmation, anointing of the sick, matrimony or marriage, reconciliation or confession, so confessing your sins, and the Eucharist, also known as communion. Now, that gets pared down by the Protestants. They weave it down to 2, and that's just baptism and Eucharist. But those other things make up part of the other faiths, or the other branches of Christianity, I should say, as well. But they just say there are 2 major beliefs that you have to, or we should probably refer to these as more rituals, but 2 major rituals that you do, whereas the Catholics have 7 rituals, and the Eastern Orthodox also have 7. Now, one of the things that comes about with this new covenant, and I'm sorry, this feels like it's kind of jumping around a little bit, but is that a lot of those rules that you had in the Old Testament are no longer needed anymore. The 10 Commandments still stick around as kind of a guiding example of what you should do and shouldn't do, but you're not going to be yelled at or viewed as sinful if you eat a food that you weren't supposed to eat, or if you get tattoos, because that was something that was banned in the Old Testament, but if you get a tattoo now, that's not a big deal. If you eat pork, which is something that's banned in the Old Testament, says no, don't do that, you're okay. So it changes the rules, and so you have more of this rule of following, again, the golden rule and helping others, try to fight for equality between people, and if you do that kind of stuff, hopefully when final judgment comes, you will be brought into heaven instead of going the other direction. Now, for our last Abrahamic religion, we have Islam, and they call their God Allah, which is just Arabic for God, just like Christians call their the Trinity. They've got the Trinity, but when they say God, they just refer to the whole Trinity there. So they use it in the same way. Just we say God in English or whatever language that you say God in, and in Islam they say it in Arabic. Now, it was founded by a guy named Muhammad in 622 CE. So this is the latest of them, about 600 years after Christianity was starting to form, and it was founded in Arabia. Now, Muhammad was originally a merchant in Mecca, and then he had some divine revelation come to him from the Archangel Gabriel, who then told him all the things that he wrote in the Quran. And actually, I should say, he didn't write it, but his followers wrote them down because he was not literate. And So their holy book is known as the Quran, and then there's also a secondary holy book known as the Hadiths. And I should also say the Christian Bible, the New Testament, and also the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament are also part of their holy books, but not looked at as with much importance as the Quran and then the Hadiths have. So, so that's their basics there. And then they have about 1.8 billion followers today, so they're the second largest religion in the world. And throughout a lot of history, after the Islamic conquest in the late 600s, early 700s, they were actually one of the either second or at the top of the most popular religions chart. And then as Christianity began to grow by being spread to North America and South America and sub-Saharan Africa, they started to be passed by that. But they are still growing today, so we'll see that number start ticking, or probably continue to tick up throughout your lives. Now they go and worship in what is known as a mosque. Again, fairly similar to a church or a synagogue, and it's different in what you do in there. Like, you don't wear your shoes in there, and you might go and pray on a rug, but the same basic concept that you have a typical site that you go to on the Sabbath to go and do your worship. There are also many branches of Islam within these three, but we're going to just focus on these three. And there's Sunni, which is the most popular one. It's 90+% of the population. Shia, which is a handful of percentages, I think around 7% or so of the global population. And then Sufi, which are a percent or less than a percent of the world population of Muslims. But those are the three main branches. And their holidays, the most prominent one is known as Ramadan, which is a 40-day, I don't want to say it as a festival, but we could just say as a celebration that ends with possibly making a trip to Mecca to recreate what Muhammad did. And I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. And then their day of worship is Friday. And you'll notice that these 3 days of worship for Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are all around the same day. They're all around the weekend. And that's because, that's what the faiths called for. They called for it being at the end of the week. And so Judaism was first, and Saturday was deemed the end of the week by them. And so they chose Saturday as their day of rest. Then when Christianity came about, they had to differentiate because they used some of the same temples and I shouldn't say temples there, but synagogues and other buildings that would be a center for worship, and they then moved it to Sunday, so they weren't conflicting with the Jewish observance of the Sabbath on Saturday. And then Islam came about, used again some of the same churches, temples, cathedrals, whatnot, and they shifted theirs to Friday. So each of them had their only holy day around the same time, so that everyone was kind of happy with things. And that's how those days came about. And so now the basic beliefs of it, of Islam, are really going to be defined by the 5 pillars that we're going to take a look at, but we'll go into a couple other things as well. One thing to really note, though, here, when we talk about Islam, is the people that practice Islam are not called Islams, but they're called Muslims, and that just means they're one who submits, and that means they're following the five basic pillars here, okay? And those 5 pillars are: 1, the Shahada, which is to say that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet or messenger. Then you have the second one, which is giving alms, which is zakat. Actually, I'm going out of order here, sorry. But zakat, which is giving alms or giving money to the poor, or the mosque to give to the poor. So that's zakat. You have salah, which is praying 5 times a day, and you pray towards Mecca each of those times. Then you've got fasting, which is done during the month of Ramadan. And what that means is that during the daylight hours, you do not eat or drink, unless you're a child or someone developing, or if you're sick or whatnot. The goal is not to die during this. The goal is just to have a little bit of discomfort, so you understand what kind of poor people are like, so then you keep giving alms and understand where people are coming from that have struggles. And so you would fast during the daylight hours, and then when if you wake up before the sun rises, you could have a breakfast, and if you stay up after the sun sets, you can also have a meal or a feast. So you eat and drink then. Otherwise, you don't do that. And then at the end of the festival of Ramadan and the fasting that you're doing there, you eventually, at some point in life, should make a Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca, to recreate the struggles of Muhammad and his eventual retaking of Mecca. And so those are the things that really define whether you're a Muslim or not. There is also possibly a sixth pillar that some people argue, which is jihad, which then has two different meanings. Basically, it means to struggle, but some people will take it as an external struggle in that you're going and fighting non-Muslims and converting them or killing them. That is what the terrorists use and Islamic extremists use. But then there's the more open and less extreme position that is just a struggle within yourself, that you're trying to overcome your demons and stuff like that make you do things that are not the best. Okay. Another thing that guides Muslims is Sharia, which are laws based on the Quran and Hadiths. There is no single Sharia, but you'll see individual Muslim countries today and back in the day have these Sharia law codes, which are based on teachings from the Quran and the Hadiths that dictate to women that they need to be veiled, or that you have to have beards, or you have to wear this certain dress or clothing or whatnot. It all just depends on where you're at. One thing that comes through all this, though, all the Sharia, the 5 pillars and all that stuff, and the basic teachings of Muhammad, is that, again, you have the golden rule there, which is something that's true pretty much in any religion that we're going to look at, is the idea of treat others how you want to be treated. And the last thing here is they are waiting for a final judgment, similar to Christians. There will be some type of final judgment at some point, but it's not clear when. Just as with the Christians, it's not clear when. And then those that have done God's service and whatnot will go to this heaven or paradise type place. Now, a couple final takeaways that I want to go through here in this to go into a little bit more depth with things, but highlight some of the similarities and differences as well, is with Abraham in Judaism and Christianity, he makes a covenant, an agreement with God about being their chosen people. Christians look at the same covenant that was made for the Jews and then say it now applies to the Christians when they come about. And Abraham is also known for but almost sacrificing his son, but then as a show of his faith to God, and that was his only biological son with his wife Ruth, and so he almost does that, and then but doesn't, and so that showed his faith, and then they trace their lineage from Abraham to Isaac, and then all Isaac's children, who eventually become the Israelites. And then Christianity branches off that. Islam takes the story of Abraham, but one of his other sons, I should say, Ishmael, who was a child of his wife's servant. Ishmael gets kicked out with his mother, and they pray for forgiveness for God and for protection, and because of their holiness, they're protected, and they become the descendants that will become the Arabs, and from the Arab people, you will get the faith of Islam. And so they view their lineage through Ishmael. And so Christians and Jews are through Jacob from Abraham, and Muslims view themselves as from Ishmael. Okay? Now, in all these, there's the idea of monotheism. All are monotheistic. They all say there's only one God. There are no other gods. Islam and Judaism do not believe in the Trinity, but Christianity has that idea of Trinity, but doesn't see them as separate gods or anything like that. And what else do I want to highlight with this? Because they're monotheistic, they're their God, and their view of it is the only true way to view God, and also the only true representation of that God. Okay. Last major section here, I believe, is we have the clergy and the structure of the religious institutions. In these faiths, you need some type of leader to guide you through worship that's an expert on it, that understands the Quran or the Bible or the Hebrew Bible or whatnot. And so in Judaism, you have these rabbis that are the scholars that will answer questions based on the Hebrew Bible and its teachings, and other rabbis throughout history. So they pull their stuff from there. In Christianity, you have pastors, bishops, popes. Depending on what kind of church you're in, you might call your pastor a priest instead. Like if you're in Catholicism, if you're a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, you're going to have a parish priest. Then you're going to have a bishop that's above them. You're going to have an archbishop, and then you're going to have a patriarch or a pope. If you are a Protestant, you usually don't have this kind of structure. You might have an overarching organization that looks over all the churches, but there isn't necessarily one person at the top, but you will have a local pastor that will explain or go through the Bible and teach you those views of Christianity. And then in Islam, you have the imams, who are the religious leaders, and they can also be leaders in politics as well, especially throughout history. Nowadays, they're maybe not having as much of an influence, but it depends on what country you're in. So last thing here is just a giant slide of all the differences and similarities between all the different Abrahamic beliefs. So that's kind of everything in a nutshell for these Abrahamic religions. You can take a look at this and pause this here to see all the differences and similarities. I'm not going to go through each of them, but that's these three faiths here in a nutshell. So hopefully you learned a little bit, and next time we'll take a look at the Indian religions.